Welcome. Yes, my friends. This is the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast, and I am your host, Rev Recluse, and welcome to the podcast. This is number 31 in the podcast series. I hope everybody's doing fantastic out there. I certainly am. I was going to do something a little bit different with this particular podcast, but then the unfortunate passing of the legendary Tommy Banks not too long ago happened, and I decided I was going to scrap that particular episode for this month and bump that back a couple of months and do something about Tommy in a tribute of some way. I have a number of different Tommy Banks records, some stuff of jazz, a lot of his arrangements that he did for Edmonton shows and orchestras and things of that nature. And I couldn't decide what I was going to play, and I wanted to play something that I read maybe a day or two after his passing in one of the articles that I read in the newspaper that described Tommy after his death in a tribute. He said that early on in his life as a musician, he realized that he could either be an artist or he could be a craftsman who sometimes did art in his life. And I thought that was a great quote and so indicative and definitive of Tommy, because Tommy was a great musician. He was a great jazz musician in the Oscar Peterson School, and I don't think that gets enough accolades, I think, now, and because, you know, a lot of other things kind of overshadowed him. His television show that he had on CBC and on ITV for a long time. He was a great arranger of all different types of music. I definitely noticed that as I started collecting my vintage Edmonton music way back when, and just so many things that Tommy was a senator. I mean, he did so many things. He was a philanthropist. He was an MC. He was a composer. He was a songwriter. He did so many things in his life. So I had a really hard time trying to pick out of one of my records in the collection. Then I realized that I had this one record that I picked up just about 2 or 3 years ago at a garage sale at, I think it was Panoka, if I'm not mistaken. And it was a record from 1973. I think it was from 1973. From CBC Radio Canada broadcast recording. It was a record label back in the early 70s. They did a lot of, I think it was bumper music, but they also did different recording sessions for bands in Edmonton and things of that nature. And Tommy, obviously being a host for CBC's Tommy Banks show during that time, he had the run of the studio, and I'm sure he was the primary arranger during that time. So this record that I found, it's an EP from 1973, and it gives a great overview of what Tommy could do, not only as a musician, but as an arranger and a songwriter and a piano player himself. So without further ado, let's start it off here, folks. This is the side A of this EP. I'm going to play the 2 songs in a row. The first song from 1973. This is the Tommy Banks original. I said, "Where Are You Gonna Put Your Head?" by Tommy Banks, with a really nice piano line by Tommy himself. And again, this is a great example of Tommy being a great piano player, period, other than arranger, other than a songwriter, other than a composer, and, you know, all of those things. He was a great piano player, and I'm pleased as punch to play this particular song. And the next song is called "Knowing When to Leave." There are 2 Hal David Burt-Bacharach songs, which would not have been uncommon during that time in the early 70s. Hal David and Burt Bacharach especially were at their hottest peak as songwriters and arrangers also. So I'm sure Tommy was an admirer of both of them. So Tommy put a song on this side anyway called "Knowing When to Leave." Boy, I need my glasses. Sorry about that, folks. It's "Knowing When to Leave" by Burt Bacharach and Hal David. So this is, without further ado, side A of this EP from 1973 on the CBC Radio Canada broadcast recording, Tommy Banks and his band on the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast. Welcome back to the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast. That was Tommy Banks and his orchestra and his band from 1973 from the CBC Radio Canada broadcast recording label. That was a song called Knowing When to Lead. That was a Burt Bacharach and Hal David song. And right before that, that was a Tommy Banks original, a song called Where You Gonna Put Your Head. And again, a great example of Tommy Banks as a piano player. And he's a great piano player, among other things in his life. So, side two, again, is a couple of more standards. The first song is called For Once in My Life, old Stevie Wonder standard. Everybody knows that. And another Burt Bacharach, Hal David song, another classic song called I'll Never Fall in Love Again. On this record and on this side, it is Bobby Kearns on guitar who is featured on this. And I think this side particularly gives a great overview and a great example of Tommy Banks as an arranger. The band was extra tight, not a note missed, right on a dime. And that's to Tommy's credit, again, as an arranger and as a composer on the other side anyway. So, again, I think this is a great example of Tommy Banks as a craftsman who sometimes made art. So without further ado, this is Tommy Banks from 1973. The first song you're going to hear is the old Stevie Wonder song, For Once in My Life. The second song you're going to hear is another great Burt Bacharach, Hal David song called I'll Never Fall in Love Again, here on the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast. Welcome back to the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast. That was Tommy Banks and his orchestra. With the first song was called "For Once in My Life," the Stevie Wonder classic, and the song that we just heard was "I'll Never Fall in Love Again," another Hal David Burt Bacharach classic that was so prevalent in the early '70s. If you saw a variety show or a daytime talk show, not unlike Tommy's, I guess, you would have heard this song sung by somebody or done by somebody at some time or another. This was they couldn't have been hotter in the early '70s anyway. And Tommy, again, does it justice as a great, great composer, collaborator, arranger, especially. I can't say enough. Tommy was one of those guys that was literally, it seemed like he was around in Edmonton forever, and he kind of was. He started here in the early 50s and just had his hand in so many different types of cultural fabric, not only in Alberta and Edmonton and Calgary especially too, and in Western Canada. And you can't say enough about that. And it is an honor to pay tribute here on the podcast. I hope you enjoyed that. I'm going to put a link to a 45 that I picked up very, very early on in my career that's on Vintage Edmonton that was, I think, done in the early 70s, right around the same time. It was a United Children's Fund promo 45 with Evelyn Quaife, the great opera singer, song called "We're All We've Got." And Tommy gives his takes on the proceedings of his recording session that he had during that recording. He was very gracious to email me with that. And I really, really, really appreciated that. And again, I hope you liked everything here. So I think that's it, folks. That's the end of the show. I will have the podcast I was originally going to do here in February, probably next month. So do not despair. It's going to be a good one. It's going to be a school record or a couple of school records. So I hope you enjoy that. I would not be, remiss without saying, yes, I am on iTunes. You can subscribe to me on iTunes. Yes, I am on Podomatic. You can subscribe to me on Podomatic. Yes, I'm on the TuneIn Radio app. You can subscribe to me on the TuneIn Radio app. Yes, I have a YouTube channel now. It is the Vintage Edmonton Music Podcast YouTube channel. All of the old podcast episodes, plus the one that you're listening to now, is on that YouTube channel. Also, I have a number of Vintage Edmonton music vinyls that I couldn't get on the podcast, or maybe just didn't fit the podcast itself, also up there. A lot of old school 1970s Vintage Edmonton comedy records also up there. So check it out. I hope you enjoy that. And I will be back at the end of March. And without further ado, I'll say I'll see you later.